Welcome to the Keys podcast, Trust Matters Lessons in Leadership with me, Ellie Potter. In the final episode of Series 1, we welcome James Pope, former head teacher and founder of the network HeadsUp4Hts. I'll be asking James about his time on the BBC documentary series School, how he thinks the sector can improve head teacher wellbeing, and why he thinks education has lost its purpose. If you enjoy this episode and would like more Trust Matters Lessons in Leadership, don't forget to leave us a review or like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Well, firstly, welcome James to the podcast. Thank you so much for coming on. If you wouldn't mind letting the listeners know about your journey in education and what's led you to the point where you're at now.
Awesome stuff. Thank you, Ellie. It's a pleasure to be here. We do a narrative activity actually as part of how we support head teachers. So I won't give you the full narrative because it's about 35 minutes long. But I started teaching I trained in about 1997, started teaching in 1998. I was 26 around that point. And had drifted through life at that stage without any real sense of purpose or kind of like, what am I going to do with my life? So it's kind of stumbled into teaching accidentally because I had a degree in applied biology. I'd done research and I decided I absolutely didn't want to do research. Didn't like it at all. I found it very boring. Apologies to anybody who loves research. I didn't enjoy it. And I'd sort of ended up classically in that place where I've got a degree in applied biology. What can I do with it? I'll give teaching a go. And I'd never worked with young people. Did my teacher training. I just absolutely fell in love with it. So I always describe it as I reached the point of being 26 and found my purpose in life, which some might argue is a kind of a third of the way in. So started teaching and I realised quite early on, I was really lucky. I worked for a head who was really inspirational and also was brilliant at kind of giving people opportunities. And I realised very early on that actually if I could make a difference for young people in my classrooms, if I had a leadership position, I could maybe make a difference. And that, that's a really compelling thing to do. That was part of my kind of vocational mission, I suppose. I didn't realise it at the time, but when I look back, it was. I didn't use that terminology then. That would have been really pompous. I started quite deliberately out on a sort of leadership with the notion that I would become a head teacher. So I was at that school. I was at Cleve School from 97 to 2009 and finished there as an assistant head. I then got a deputy headship at another school that was local to where I was in Gloucestershire. Was there for 5 years and then I got the headship at Marwood and I was at Marwood for 4 years. So I think we're going to delve a bit deeper into the headship at Marwood, so I won't go into that in too much detail now. And I stopped there in 2018 for reasons that we'll probably discuss. I didn't really know what I was going to do at that point. I didn't have a job to go to, but I knew from my own experience of headship that I wanted to create some form of network or bringing together of head teachers who probably felt like I did about the education system, which we'll probably get into in a bit more detail. And so I created Inspire Educate. As this notion of a vehicle for me to, do what I didn't know what I wanted to do at that stage. I really didn't have a clear idea. So I've got a real passion for leadership. I've got a real passion for strategic thinking and strategic planning and vision setting. That's always been the thing that I've really enjoyed about leadership. So I knew I wanted to do something in that space. Long story short, but HeadsUp4Hts was born out of that notion of can we create a network for heads, which isn't about the strategic demand or the operational demand is just about them as human beings. Can we create a space where heads can connect together and go, I'm having a great time, or I'm exhausted, or I'm fed up, or whatever it might be. And here we are. And that started in 2019. So here we are 5 and a bit years later. That network's now some 10,000 people in organisation strong. And, we've done lots of wellbeing support, which is what our focus. We do 3 things at HeadsUp4Hts. We celebrate the work of the education system because we think there's a sort of, overtly negative narrative about education, which really, really is wrong. And we do a lot of support in the wellbeing space for head teachers, and we've supported about 4,500 heads in the last 4.5 years. And again, we'll talk about that, I think, in terms of how we do that. And then the third thing we do is campaign for change in the system.
Yeah.
Not change for change's sake, but around this notion of, what do we want our education system to be? And actually, our passion is to have, I think sometimes there can be a detachment between the people who are actually leading the functional units of our education system, schools, and the organisations that then influence policy setting.
Yeah.
And we wanted head teachers' voices to be heard, I suppose, in terms of actually, if we're going to campaign for change, maybe we should ask the people who are running our schools what they would like to be different. That without that sort of sounding noble, but essentially the campaigning that we do is very representative of the head teachers who are in our network. Yeah. And it's predominantly, the change that we're looking for is predominantly cultural. And it's related to, actually, can we just be a bit more positive about the work that schools are doing? And can we be a bit more intentional about the way that we support head teachers in what pretty much everybody acknowledges is quite a challenging job? So rather than leaving the support, for it to be reactive, can we just be a bit more front-footed and go, and we'll talk about that a bit more. But that's essentially that's the potted version of how I got from being a sort of slightly drifting 25, 26-year-old to somebody who runs Heads Up for Head Teachers.
And you had a very unconventional time in your first headship. You alluded to it there. Unconventional might be an understatement. So you were actually a part of a BBC documentary school. It was your first headship.
Yeah.
I'll let you tell the listeners what happened in that documentary and why it was so life-changing for you.
It's still quite painful. I still might get quite emotional. I had to write about this because we're writing a book, and I had to write about this, and I still get quite emotional about it. But I'd worked really hard to become a head teacher, and I knew I wanted that job. I knew what I wanted to do in it. I knew what I wanted to do as a head teacher. And the school that I became head teacher of was Marwood School in South Gloucestershire. And Marwood School would be classically what Amanda Spielman at the time would have called a sort of coasting, drifting. And it wasn't at all. It was actually facing some really serious challenges to do with local demographic changes. So it was a school which was designed for a population of 1,200, 1,300 children, young people. When I got there, I think there were about there's somewhere between 700 and 800 on roll. And essentially what that meant is we had some significant financial restructuring to do. And restructuring the school, we had to restructure how it was operating. And not only that, but despite the best efforts of the people working there, actually the outcomes weren't great. The quality of education wasn't brilliant. And so I joined in September 2014. And I still remember the moment where, because you do a head teacher's interview and lots of people talk about this. It's a pretty intense 2 days. Yeah. You don't get a huge amount of time to do sort of due diligence and stuff like that. But I'd looked at the finances, and as far as I was aware at that point, back in April 2014, the books balanced. It was only in September, when I was heading towards my first governor's meeting, that it became apparent that the books didn't balance for all sorts of complex reasons, which I won't go into. But essentially what it meant was I think I needed to save somewhere around £500,000 in that academic year. And the only way you're going to do that in a school is through staffing. So that was that became the story of the school, really, was in the lowest funded local authority, or the second lowest funded local authority as it was then in the country, in a school with a falling demographic, which was never going to change because of the way schools had been built around it, which had cut off some of the supply lines in terms of young people who came to Marwood. So, that had to be faced. That falling demographic had to be faced. It was never going to be reversed. And that hadn't really been accepted up until the point at which I joined. How do you improve the quality of education whilst your money is dropping? So I think the income that I was working with when I joined in September 2014 was 5.4 million. The budget that I signed off when I left 4 years later in 2018 was 2.8, I think. So we had to save £2.6 million in 4 years.
That's a huge amount of money.
Yeah, which is a huge amount of money. However, having said that, despite that being a bit of a shock and not necessarily expected, it just felt like it was an incredible opportunity for me to do the thing that I'd always sort of said I thought I was good at, which was to be creative. You're not going to solve that conundrum with, probably normal ways of doing things. So it needed real leadership. I think I provided that. I think that was definitely recognised by, the sort of nascent trust that I was in, which was CSET, by the local authority, and actually, by sort of fairly bigger bodies in the Southwest. That, we were doing a pretty good job given the toxicity of the circumstances and the finances. And I think we had a lot of fun with it. It was challenging and it was really, really difficult. We avoided making any redundancies. We did things with the staff. I think that I would like to think, looking back, that the staff felt supported and it felt like a nurturing environment. The young people and their parents, I think everybody recognised that things were getting better, essentially. There was a narrative of things getting better, and actually, the young people were enjoying their schooling more. The results were getting better. The outcomes were getting better. At the end of my third year, with basically everybody sort of, assuming that we were doing a really good job, and actually lots of people coming to look at what we were doing and how we were doing it, we had Ofsted arrive in May of what would have been 2017 and essentially put us in special measures, which was a shock to me. When we were self-evaluating at RI, so we definitely weren't pretending that we were brilliant. We knew that we had stuff to do, but in no way in a month's Sundays did I think the school was special measures. I think it probably was borderline when I'd taken it on. I think it was generally accepted that it may have been borderline special measures when it was taken on. And, I can sit here 6 years later and say, that was a shock, and people are going to listen and they're going to go, well, yeah, you would say that, wouldn't you? But actually, it was a shock to the whole community. And when I say the community, I mean the young people, the staff, the parents, colleague head teachers, within South Gloucestershire and beyond that as well. People who'd come to look at the school and they were like, there's no way you're a special measures school. Anyway, we were put in special measures. In that final year, in special measures, we'd also signed to do the TV programme School for BBC Two with the production company. And that was my last year. It was, nobody taking the financial difficulties away because, special measures doesn't come with any... I still don't quite know what special measures mean, other than we're going to come and scrutinise you a bit more. There don't appear to be any actual special measures as such. Which was a point that our parents kept making, funnily enough. Well, presumably we'll be able to solve the funding. We'll be able to solve the funding. I was like, no, there is no extra money. So in that final year, we still had to save £900,000, I think, between that year and the next academic year. So I always used to say that although we're in special measures, that still wasn't my biggest conundrum. The biggest conundrum was, how do I save another £900,000 in this next 12 months in that situation? And partway through that year, for reasons that we'll get into, but it was around about the February, March time, I actually, do you know what? I'm done. Physically, I wasn't particularly well. Mentally, I definitely wasn't well. My wife was worried about me. My family were worried about me. I was working ridiculously long hours. I wasn't sleeping. I wasn't eating particularly well. I wasn't exercising. I was driving to Marwood one day and Basement Jack's Where's Your Head At came on the radio. And I just burst into tears because it was like, where is my head at? And I decided then that I was going to quit. So the thing that I'd worked intentionally towards for the entirety of my career,
you had to give up.
I had to give up.
What do you think are some of the reasons why head teachers struggle with their well-being so much?
It's really complex. Obviously, we've, in the last 5 years of HeadsUp4Hts, we've worked with a lot of heads, and that gives us a huge insight, I guess, into the factors which impact on people's well-being. But at the core of it, and the thing that we work on with heads, is this notion of purpose. Why do you do the job that you do? And we find that out from heads. When we work with them, we find out what the purpose is. And it is nearly always the case that it is a version of making a difference for other people. So most people come into education because they want to make a difference for other people, young people, and most people step into leadership positions and then headship because they want to make a difference. So what you tend to find, is this, I don't think it's fair to say that this is universally true, but certainly with the greater majority of people who are leading in education, is their driver is to make a difference for other people, and therefore they are servant leaders by very definition. They give of themselves. So what we find with the heads that we are working with, and was the case for me, is that you tend to give of yourself endlessly until there is nothing left. And you just keep giving, and you keep giving, and you keep giving. Because that's what you're there to do, right? You're there to give. You're there to make a difference for other people, regardless of how you are, or indeed how your own family is, or anything like that. So that notion of servant leadership is really, really important, because people who feel that will keep giving until there's nothing left.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the factors. And when you then start to unpick it, so we survey our heads fairly often, and it's interesting because, workload will always be up there. It's a really busy job. But one of the things we talk about is actually, do you know what? You just had 6 weeks off for the summer holiday, and obviously heads and teachers don't get 6 weeks off. They have to work during that period of time. But essentially, you're out of the school environment for that period of time. You come back in September and somebody gives you a to-do list that's got 50 things on it, and you're energized and you're ready to go, and you crack through that to-do list. If you give somebody the same to-do list in November, they're not going to approach it with the same energy. And so we talk about the fact that actually workload is important, because actually people are demanded too much of, and they have to do too many different things. However, that's often not the thing that's making people struggle with their well-being. It's their energy levels and their connection to this sense of purpose. Am I doing stuff which is purposeful? Or am I just doing stuff that feels like it's a bunch of things I'm being asked to do for other people? And you often find that's the case. And we don't work, we think that there are enough forums and networks and connections for head teachers to make in their working life, their professional persona, in regard to, the strategic and operational load of being a head teacher. So we don't work in that space, although the work that we do does impact on that. We work on the human being that's sat underneath it. So when we survey our heads, the things that they talk about are being isolated, imposter syndrome. Can I do this job? And actually, the bigger the job gets, that's understandable. So this sense of imposter syndrome, I don't know whether I can do this. Competition, which is an interesting one, because we've probably got the most collaborative education system that we've ever had. But actually, because of things like performance tables and because of Ofsted judgments and outcomes, and actually, interestingly, where resources are scarce, so things like where you're recruiting and there's a scarcity of maths teachers, actually schools are still quite competitive in those spaces. So this sense of competition sits there. The fact that it always feels as if they have to beat the school down the road still weighs heavy with a lot of heads. High stakes accountability, which is unique in that it's one on its own, but it also amplifies all of the others. So it amplifies the isolation and the imposter syndrome and the competition. And then the fifth one is impact on personal and professional relationships and well-being. So actually, I'm not getting on as well with people at home, or I'm not getting, and that's what we tend to find coming through in our surveying. And therefore, that's what we support people with. Actually, what strategies can we give you that are going to help you not feel isolated? Going to reinforce the notion that actually you're doing a really brilliant job in incredibly challenging circumstances. So that's kind of that's the work that we do. And a lot of that, I guess, came out of my own experience, but also the people who were calling me after the TV program aired, because that's where Heads Up for Head Teachers really started, was people phone me up and going, "Oh my God, that's me. Can I talk to you? I'm going through that at the moment. Can I talk to you?" And Heads Up started by offering a crisis coaching. And we still do that. We still, alongside others like Headrest, we still do that 5 years later. And we just get a trickle of people calling us every week going, "Help. There's nobody for me to talk to." And people say, "What about the unions?" And we work with the unions. We've partnered with the NAHT and ASCL over the years. But they do a very specific role around the, I guess, supporting the head professionally. Yeah. What we're doing is supporting the head teacher as the human being, who often, I've done hundreds of these calls over the years, and, I'd hear, every time I think I've heard the worst story I've heard, I hear something else. But, head teachers who don't feel they can leave their house, because when you because the job is so aligned to people's purpose and their values, when you lose it, it's a personal attack.
Of course,
It actually attacks you deep down at a personal level. And, therefore your self-esteem and your notion of self-value is at absolute rock bottom. And so, we've supported heads who haven't been able to leave their house. They might live in the community where they've been a head teacher, and they're so ashamed by the fact that they're no longer the head teacher or they're not doing the job anymore. So we still do that work, but we do that alongside. That's what we call really reactive work. And actually what we want to do is be much more intentional about the way the system supports head teachers to do the challenging job.
And when you speak about the system, if trust leaders are listening now, what are those strategies that they can put in place to support their head teachers and local authorities as well? Like, what should those people who sit above the head teachers and should be there as their support system, what are some of those practical things they can do to support them as the human as well as the profession?
I could give a really glib answer. Get in touch with HeadsUp4Hts.
Contact details below.
Contact details below. Yeah, get in touch with us. The first thing is it is complex. But often a lot of the wellbeing work, we talk about the wellbeing cake at HeadsUp4Hts. And the reason why we came up with that, I don't know whether it's an analogy or a metaphor, but the reason why we came up with it, because what we see is a lot of cake decoration when it comes to wellbeing, whether this is young people or staff or leaders. And in essence, if somebody has become detached from their purpose, if they've lost that sense of, I don't even know why I'm doing this job anymore, it's not the job that I thought it was going to be, whatever it is. If somebody's got that, then you can offer them as much yoga or cakes on a Friday in the staff room or as you want. You're decorating nothing.
It's not going to bring that purpose back.
It's not going to bring that purpose back. So when we talk with local authorities and the work that essentially we do in the system, which is focused on those 5 things of isolation, imposter syndrome, etc., the work that we do is very much about creating connection for leaders.
Yeah.
Because the reality is that if you've not been a head teacher, it's very difficult to understand what it's like to be a head teacher. And so, the reason why we do peer support groups at HeadsUp4Hts for head teachers is because they're in a space with 13, 14, 15 other head teachers who get it.
Yeah.
And their group is facilitated by somebody who is or has been a head teacher. So what I would say to CEOs and trust leaders is you have to be really intentional about exactly what it is that you're supporting. So we do tend to get quite a bit of confusion around the difference between supervision and mentoring and coaching support. And all of those things are valuable. In an ideal world, a head teacher would have access to all of those things, but they're actually doing 3 very different things. And indeed, you could put counselling in there as well.
Yeah.
So if somebody's really struggling with their mental health, then, but they're doing very different things. And we tend to, I guess, fall into the trap in our education system of sort of think, well, we offer professional coaching or instructional coaching. So like, great, that's really useful. We're not saying don't do that. But actually, you may not be addressing the thing that actually needs to be addressed. So you might not be, because that's very much focused on the professional. You might not actually be helping the human being who's struggling underneath that, what we call the cloak of invincibility that heads have to wear. And if you're not supporting the human being, then again, you can do as much in that space as you want. They're going to be a better and better technical head teacher. But if they've got this detachment from purpose and therefore their well-being is dropping, then that's not going to make any difference. So those are that's the kind of work that we do, and those are the conversations that we have with the, I don't know, we've set up, I think we've worked with about 35 of the local authorities now across the country, and we're working with more all of the time, and with the many trusts that we've worked with. You have to engage at that very human level, because the well-being issue, people will talk about workload, and that immediately makes people focus on fixing, okay, what technical aspects of the role can we get rid of or improve what we're doing or become more efficient in or become more effective in. And actually what we find time and time again is you have to deal with the kind of human heart first.
And when you're talking about the lack of purpose, obviously that's wider from what you've suggested. It's not just through head teachers, it's the CEOs, so it's everyone throughout the system. Why do you think education has seemed to have lost its purpose, and what can we do to bring back some of that clarity?
Gosh, that's a really big question. Look, it's really simple. I think it's quite simple what we try to do in education. And by the way, I think schools do it brilliantly. And I wish one of the things that we talk about is celebration at Heads Up for Head Teachers. And I wish we were just a bit more celebratory about the brilliant job our schools do on a day in, day out basis. And, it could be, even our fiercest critic, Ofsted, has never said in the last 20 years, probably longer than that less than 80% of our schools are good or outstanding. And the next 10% used to be satisfactory.
Yeah.
We now say RI. It's kind of like you think about what that actually means. And so the proportion of schools that need real help and support, and it's probably contextual, it's probably to do with society and the area that they are serving and all of that sort of stuff. I just wish we were a bit more appreciative and celebratory of the great work that the greater majority of our schools and staff are doing. That would help enormously. The narrative in the media and the narrative out of the DFE and the narrative out of Ofsted and the narrative culture in our system is just so negative, and there is so much to celebrate. So I'm going to put that on the table first before I then say, I think schools have become really good at doing what they are told to do. I think the question that we need to be asking is, what are we asking our schools to do? And is that purpose still fit for purpose? Is it, and I think there has to be, and I don't think we're going to get it yet. I hope that it's going to come. It might come as part of the curriculum review, the curriculum and assessment review. I expect that could be a nudge in the right direction. I think the changes at Ofsted could be a nudge in the right direction. But I think it would be nice to have some greater sense of purpose coming out of the DFE about what it is we want education to be doing. Why are we educating our children? And actually, what difference is it at Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5 and into higher education? And what difference is it in the early years? What are we actually trying to do at those different phases? And I don't think we have that conversation enough. And I don't think we engage the people who are actually delivering it for us in that conversation enough. And the Brookings Institute in the States, they did a really interesting project. So one of our partners is Big Change in London. And the Brookings Institute did a really interesting survey of parent groups around the world, asking them what they thought the purpose of education was. And surprisingly enough, the outlier was Britain. Or England specifically, because in essence, what parents were saying was it's all about the outcomes. It's all about the GCSEs. It's about and those things are important. I think we really need to look at assessment at the age of 16 and actually what its purpose is and what its value is. I think there's a big question mark around that for me. But those qualifications are important, but they shouldn't be the purpose. They are the outcome.
Yeah.
And I think we need to get back into a conversation around what, and including young people and parents. What do we think the purpose? Why is England an outlier globally in that regard?
Yeah.
Why do we think differently? How have we created that narrative around education that it's all about the GCSEs, it's all about the A levels, it's all about the outcomes and the results? And just for clarity, I'm not saying those things aren't important. But education is about so much more than that. What we are doing for young people on a daily basis. And when you look at, again, what Amanda Spielman might have called in the past, some of our most stuck schools. I can't remember the phraseology that she used, but I remember being sort of slightly disgusted by it about 3-4 years ago. It's kind of like, is anybody actually assessing what those schools are doing for young people in their community? And some of the communities that they're serving, is anybody actually looking at what an amazing piece of work it is even to get those young people to come to school in the morning, and how much effort that takes and how much resource that takes? Because nobody's solving those problems for schools. And they've put those problems very squarely at the responsibility of schools, and that's fine. But you know what? We better start including that in how we judge how well our schools are doing then.
Yeah.
Because you can't have both. And I think there is a bit of tendency for us to have both, where you're going to say, well, yes, you have to do all of that stuff because nobody else in society is necessarily doing it. So you need to do all of that stuff because we've dismantled the public services that would have done it. Oh, but by the way, you can't then use that as an excuse as to why the school isn't performing as well as it should do.
And what are some of the changes you would like to see in the Ofsted review and the curriculum review? What are some of those key changes you think could actually make a real difference?
Well, one word judgments are toxic, but they've gone. I think we need to be really careful that the report card or whatever that looks like doesn't end up just replicating one word judgments. I can't underestimate how toxic it was, not just for Marwood, but I mean to fall under that umbrella of inadequate. So I mean to tell a whole community that it's inadequate. All of the young people, because it doesn't just sit with the school, it sits with the whole community. So the toxicity of that, I am beyond delighted to be seeing the back of.
Yeah.
I think we've got to be really careful that we don't end up replicating it. We've had some really positive conversations with Ofsted in the last 6 months about, some of the processes and the thoughts, and we're looking forward to engaging with them a bit more around that. But the things that we've said is actually what we would like is a bit more of a positive narrative. Actually, can we have a bit more appreciative inquiry? So, rather than, and I've always said for as long as I've been engaged in these sorts of conversations in the last 6 years, I haven't got a problem with Ofsted. I've got a problem with the culture that Ofsted creates in the system. It's a cultural issue. And I used to have this conversation when I've been on panels with, Michael Wilshaw and the like. I still think the culture is very much, or the culture that surrounds education, and that's a relationship. So it's as much about the responsibility of the way it's perceived by the school and the head teacher as it is about the culture that Ofsted do keep reinforcing it. The culture appears and has appeared, and I think still remains to be, we don't think you're very good until we come and inspect you, and then we will decide whether you're very good or not. I mean, talk about glass half empty. When your own data is telling you that 80 to 90% of schools are actually doing a really good job, why is that the starting point for inspection? And it still is. I don't care what they say. It still is the starting point for lots of inspections is, we don't really believe you. We know you've done your stuff, but we're going to test you. And, heads, going back to the support work, but heads sit under that, it can be 18 months, 2 years, 3. We've got heads in our system who've been waiting 3-4 years for their inspection.
That dread that
and
hangs over
and the
and
fear
builds,
that creates. So, the conversations that we've had is about, can we please change that narrative? Can it be a bit more celebratory that actually, do you know what? Schools are doing a really great job. Are there things that schools could be doing better? Absolutely. Just speak to any head teacher and they will tell you exactly what needs to be done better in their school community. So maybe just have the conversation with them about what needs to be done better rather than dismissing them out of the conversation. So that notion of, and there are frameworks for this stuff, right? Appreciative inquiry. So that notion of appreciative inquiry. And I think there's a danger people might be listening and saying, well, that sounds a bit soft, James. It's not. Appreciative inquiry is incredibly challenging. What are you doing well and why is it working well? To understand the design principles behind why something is working well and unpicking it and then applying those design principles to something that you want to improve or develop, that's really challenging work. So it's not soft at all. So I think Ofsted could help enormously. I think they've got to be really careful with the report card. That goes without saying. I just think we could end up in a situation where we just change the rules a little bit and just end up playing the same game.
Repackage it.
And just repackaging it into something else. But I think the culture with which they approach inspection. And then the third thing I would say is, they have to, and this is that they've tried to address this, I know they have, but they then have to address the thing that happens after the introduction of every new framework, which in essence, and I'm not criticising any individuals because I understand why they do it, but in essence is people who are Ofsted inspectors going round telling schools how they can do well in their Ofsted inspection. Because all that does is create this flurry of fear often and anxiety and stress. It's not intended like that, but that's one of the consequences. And I think we have to stop this. Actually, do you know what? There isn't any trick to Ofsted. There isn't any trick to doing well in your Ofsted. So I think some of that, they have to get a handle on some of that behaviour in their own workforce, and sort of saying, actually, no, we don't do this. We inspect. And this is how we inspect. This is the culture of inspection. This is how we inform people about what we found out in that inspection. I think all of it could be a lot more celebratory and positive. That would change things for head teachers in our education system overnight.
Yeah.
Literally overnight.
Yeah, for sure.
And then I think there is a similar piece of, we talk about purpose. I think there is a similar piece of work to be done, and there are some great organisations. There's Rethinking Assessment. I think there is some similar work to be done around, why do we repeat the same traps around how we assess young people? Collectively, individually, in individual subjects, but across their subject suite and their curriculum. Why do we keep falling into the same traps, and why do we still have the same inequities that creates the same problems? There is a reason. I think there is a reason why we tend to, most of our data, roughly, with some swings and roundabouts, there is a reason why most of our data tends to top out at around 75% of young people doing well in their SATs or in their GCSEs or in their A-levels. And maybe not A-levels, because that's a more defined group, but certainly at GCSEs and SATs. There's a reason why I think it bottoms out at 75%. And I mean, the white paper from whenever it was 2 years ago that said, SATs, we should be aiming for 90%. It's kind of like, where have you plucked that figure from?
The system's not set up to make that work. Yeah.
Well, the assessment system's not set up to make it work. This is Askell's point about the forgotten third. I would call them maybe the forgotten quartile, but it's the same principles that are play, which is, there are a group of our young people, and it arguably is an expanding group of our young people for whom our education system is not working and has not worked. And that's partly rooted in assessment, is because it's the way that we assess them that drives that behaviour. So I think we have to look, especially at assessment at the age of 16, I think we have to look at that assessment and go, actually, what behaviours are we driving in our education system and in our curricula, especially in secondary school, as a consequence of. And it's quite interesting when you look at this stuff. I mean, I would encourage people who are listening to this because I don't know when, I got it. I only did this a couple of weeks ago, and I kind of think, actually, I wonder when the last time I ever did this. But it's quite interesting to type into Google. You'll get a kind of AI response, but it'll be formed from, government website and government documentation. But just what is the purpose of Key Stage 1? What is the purpose of Key Stage 3? What's interesting is when you get to Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4, what is the purpose of Key Stage 3? It says to prepare children for their GCSEs. Yeah. When did that happen? I thought the purpose of Key Stage 3 was to inspire young people in a suite of subjects, to get them excited about those subjects, to get them learning in those subjects, to develop skills, to get them to acquire knowledge. This false argument in our education system around knowledge or skills, it's never, we've got to stop setting these binary positions up. It's all of it.
Yeah.
We should be going, the purpose of education is to do, character education, skills education, knowledge education. But by defining it so tightly around knowledge and therefore examinations, so that apparently that's the purpose of Key Stage 3. I've not written that. That's what the government says. Well, is that it? So year 7, 8 and 9, 3 years of my life as a young person are about getting ready for my GCSEs.
Getting into the finish line, yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Oh, that sounds thrilling,
Productive,
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think, and again, really clear, schools are brilliant at it. I'm not criticising the schools. It's what we're asking schools to do. So I think that assessment at 16 is crucial. It's really crucial to have some creative, and there are loads of people working on it. And I hope, they get the recognition and make the headway that they should do. But, I'm just not sure the value of that qualification at the age of 16. In the great scheme of things, I'm not sure what it does. And I think it, for the people that it does something for, who we might talk about in a bit more detail, but the people that it does something for, if you took it away, I'm not sure what damage that would create. But the damage it creates for the children it doesn't do something for, in terms of self-esteem, And let's be clear, when our school talk about the forgotten third, or I talk about the forgotten quartile, we're talking about predominantly children with SEND. We're talking about children who come from disadvantaged backgrounds. Those are the majority of that quartile. But to do that, you can't keep beating schools over the head in an assessment system, which means a quarter of them are never going to be successful.
Yeah. And despite some of those huge challenges, and there are huge challenges in the sector, one of your big things is celebration.
Yeah.
And I don't want the podcast to go through without having some of those big moments of celebration. As you said, 80 to 90% of schools are good, outstanding. It's amazing. And I mean, our education system, as you said, like there are definitely challenges and things that need improvement, but we've made a long way. We've come a long way in the last 20 years. And what are some of those things you'd really want to celebrate and say, these are the things we are getting right?
Well, I guess this is the stuff that we lose, right? We miss it because, Ofsted are only ever going to say 80%, but the 80% of schools, the 20% that aren't good or outstanding in whatever the latest data set, you compare those schools to the 20% or even the 80% who were good or outstanding 15 years. So what we miss all of the time is that the whole system is developing together all of the time. I often say we probably got the best set of educational leaders, school leaders in this country that we've ever had. It'll be better in 6 months' time. It'll be because we keep developing all of the time. But you lose any notion of that development. Notice I'm using the word development rather than improvement. One of the things I'd like to get rid of is the word improvement, because I think it encapsulates that negativity. This isn't working. What are we going to do about it? Rather than, actually, a lot of what we do works really, really well. Right, we're going to focus and develop this thing next. This is a process. There is no plateau that education's going to reach. There's no plateau that a school's going to reach. That's it. We've done it. Show me a school that thinks it's the finished article, and I'll show you a school that in 5 years' time will probably not be doing very well. So, I don't know of a school or a school leader in the country who is not focused on the next thing that they want to develop and the next thing that they want to develop. Yeah. However, when you make that about improvement, we can become kind of very narrowly obsessed. And this is one of the things that we deal with at HeadsUp4Hts, we become very narrowly obsessed and we miss all the great stuff. I challenge anybody. One of the things that I love, I guess, is a real privilege in the work that I do is supporting leaders. But actually, I also work with some schools very closely, which means I get to visit them. I challenge anybody who's got some question marks about our education system, just go and sit in the head's office for an hour and have a chat with them. And then just listen to the noise of the school. And, for me, that's... And again, people are going to listen to this and go, it sounds really soft, but actually, do you know what? That is the purpose of education. And, okay, it's half term for a lot. It's not for everybody, but for a lot of people. But if it wasn't half term and we were sat having this conversation, then there would be 24,000 schools with however many hundreds of thousands of young people and adults in them doing great work right now as you and I are talking. That's amazing. That's amazing. And, I just, why are we missing this stuff? So there's so much of what we can capture. There's so much about, I guess, the individual narratives and stories of young people that we should be celebrating. We do a great job, and lots of young people benefit massively from our education system. So the question for me is not... it'll always be, how do we develop that and keep developing it? Absolutely. But let's do it from a position of celebration. The question is, should we be doing it differently? Not can we, not will we, but should we? Is the world changed to the extent at which we need to rethink what we're asking our education system to do? And that becomes, that's a really powerful place to occupy, I think. And it takes you to some really, and again, because you're coming at it through the lens of appreciation, so it takes you to some really interesting places. So I quite often do this with trusts and schools that I'm working with. But it's, quite an interesting question, especially in secondary schools, but it also applies in primary schools. What would your school look like if you started with inclusion? So if inclusion wasn't something that was bolted on, how would you design your school if you had a blank piece of paper and you started with inclusion? And I don't think they'd look like how they look now. And so it takes you into this creative space. And so, one of the things that I would like to see more of, and this will happen as a consequence of Ofsted getting it right, and some of those other things changing, is us getting back to this notion of curiosity and asking the why question. Actually, why do we do that like that?
Mm-hmm.
Is there a really good purposeful reason why we do that like that? And again, we do that in the support work because the why question is such a powerful one from a sense of well-being and purpose, but also from a sense of curiosity. Why do we do that? Why do we do that like that? Why do we insist on there being 30 children in a box with a teacher in front of them in secondary schools? I'm not sure. Now, I think I know what the answer is. I think it's economic. It's the most efficient way of educating young people. Is it the most effective way? I don't know. The answer might be yes, actually. But if we don't, the point is, if we don't think about it, we just keep replicating it and nothing changes.
Yeah.
So that notion of curiosity. So we might do the kind of review of actually, why do we do that? And then we might go through it. And actually, do you know what? It works. Great. And, 4 children in and passing through our education system. The eldest is 19 and the youngest is 9. There's 10 years between them. And I always say my biggest fear is that my 9-year-old's experience will be exactly the same as my 19-year-old. They're 10 years apart.
The world is going to be so different.
How different is the world going to be in 10 years? But actually their experience of education is exactly the same. That doesn't feel right to me. As a parent, it doesn't feel right to me. It doesn't feel right to me as an educator. I'm kind of think, so, I often talk about, I think one of the issues with Ofsted is I think it closes down transformation. It's all about reformation. Can we make the horse and cart better? How can we tweak the wheel? How do we make the harness better? And then you've got this group of people in education who are desperate to kind of go, can we build a car? And Ofsted are going, no, don't do that. No, we'll use a horse. And I think, I'm kind of, I guess I'm comic effect or amplifying the point, but it does feel like that.
Yeah.
No, don't do anything. No.
Don't change.
This is how we've decided it needs to be done, and we're going to do it like that. And I think we are in danger of closing down a lot of really creative thinking by a lot of leaders. So let's open that up. And then we can, but it comes through that process. So, you ask the question, what can we celebrate? I think there's so much to celebrate, appreciate, and then we can move into curiosity.
We like to finish the podcast with 4 quick fire questions.
Right, okay.
So here we go. So number 1, what do you think is the biggest challenge facing the education sector right now?
Gosh, the biggest. I think when I try and answer these questions, I always look for something which has got connectivity in it. But I guess I come back to my point. I think the culture is the biggest issue. You can talk about lots of specifics, and I'm not trying to sidestep the question. But for me, it impacts on everything. So, it has to be attractive. We need children who want to go to school. We need parents who want to send their children to school, and we need staff who want to work in schools. And I think if you look at those, all of those 3 things are quite specific challenges that schools are facing. Some schools more than others. So I think that, this notion of the culture, again, can we please change the narrative? And I think if we do that, it will impact on so much.
Yeah.
The irony of, I find it ironic anyway, of the same DFE which funds TV adverts that tell the world how wonderful it is for teachers to work in schools.
Actually saw one of those this morning.
Yeah, it's it's the same organisation which is telling the world that actually our education system isn't doing a very good job. Well, if I'm looking to move into education or teaching, I don't buy the kind of glossy TV advert. Do you know what I mean? I kind of think. So I think there are so many challenges, but I think the connectivity between them comes through this notion of actually, do you know what? We're doing a really, really good job.
The second question is, what motivates you on your difficult days?
That's a good question. I'm really lucky. And I didn't say this earlier on, but one of the reasons why I kind of ended up doing HeadsUp4Hts was because, I had the TV program made about me, and that kind of gave me a huge amount of exposure and support and love from the education system. But there are hundreds of heads, thousands of heads who don't get that. And that is still a huge motivator for me. And I'm really lucky It's very difficult to measure the impact of what we do. Really simply, we talk about, the 4,500 heads that we've worked with, they would all recommend us to another head teacher. That's a really simple metric. But what motivates me is when you kind of read the individual statements. So when we finish working with somebody and we've helped them set up their group and they're sustaining their own support and their own well-being, we always ask them for just tell us how this has impacted on you. And so we've got thousands of those anecdotal statements. And if I ever need motivating, I just need to read a couple of them.
Yeah.
Because it is just incredible.
Question number 3. What has been your proudest achievement in your career so far?
Oh, gosh. Look, well, there are so many. This is actually, hot tip. If you want to look after your own well-being, actually start keeping a record of all of the things that you've done as a head teacher that have been brilliant. There are so many. I love being a teacher. I loved being a head, despite how challenging it was. I really loved being a head teacher. And what I always say about, Marwood is a lot of what I had to, because I think often schools go through cycles, and I think a lot of what I had to do as a head teacher, I always describe as kind of like the foundation work. And so it'll probably never get seen, but and the people who came after me were able to build on those foundations and create whatever it is that they wanted to create, and that's great. But I will always be proud of the effort and the work that we put into the foundations at Marwood, because if we hadn't done that work at that time, it wouldn't now be able to be. So I'm really proud of that. I can't answer that question and not say I'm proud of the HeadsUp4Hts network, nor not say that I'm not. It's just when I watch the way those heads support each other, it is just incredible.
Yeah.
It's just incredible. So that HeadsUp4Hts has got to be the proudest thing I've done.
And the final question, what are you most looking forward to this academic year?
I think I'm looking forward to really purposeful change. I think from what I'm hearing about Ofsted, I'm really excited and positive about that. We've got the curriculum. So there's a bunch of sort of system level stuff. The curriculum and assessment review, I think, has a real opportunity for people, if for nothing else, for people to have their voices heard.
Yeah.
And whatever happens as a result of it, I think we're going to see massive amounts of change with the curriculum and assessment, because I don't think the funding's there to make that massive change happen. But I think there could be, again, a kind of switch in the dial, a slight reframing. So I'm excited about that.
Thank you so much for coming on, James. It's been so lovely to speak to you today.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you, Ellie.
Thank you for listening, and thank you very much to James for joining us today. To find out more about how The Key can support your trust, please visit thekeysupport.com/trust. For more information about James, links to relevant resources, and information on how to subscribe to the Trust Matters monthly newsletter, head to the description below. If you enjoyed this episode and would like more Trust Matters lessons in leadership, don't forget to leave us a review or like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.